Hey, good Arctic morning for a significant amount of us. This is Carlos, aka CJ. Hope everyone's having a great day so far. Today is Wednesday, February the 17th, and losing track of the days here. Very excited to be joined by London Paul of the Series Report. Many of you are very familiar with Paul's work. Please check that out over at theseriesreport.com and also find out about his premium content, which is his daily podcast and updates. Something I always look forward to is getting that email update and the double podcast day. So, Paul, great day. How are you, sir?
Yes, I'm very well. And yourself?
Doing great, Paul. I took a mini vacation. A lot of people have been messaging and asking if everything's okay with our
Yes.
streams and what we're doing. And I long story short, I got away with the family just for a few days to get out of winter. It was perfect timing because I was in beautiful sunny Florida and I was sending pictures to people and they're like, "Stop rubbing it in. We're getting 12 inches of snow today." But yeah, so doing fine. Thank you for asking, Paul. And it's an opportune time to update our listeners as to a lot of things going on right now, and tracking everything that's happening, Paul.
Yes, and we, yeah, you obviously sent the message regarding some subject matter, and we thought it was kind of worth discussing. Well, we focus a lot on geopolitics and finance and economics and such subject matter. It's good to sort of deal with the personal side of what's unfolding and has been really for the last, I would say, 12 months. And of course, not just solely related to the pandemic, but there's all the sort of other aspects bolted onto that is now starting to unfold in people's lives, and it's things are starting to unravel rather quickly. And so it'd be good to get your perspective to start with, and then I'll sort of feed off that, I guess.
Well, Paul, I think in part taking a look at the attempt and I think I'm going to label it distractions of what's occurring as we navigate through the global economic reset. And I think in part that's what the media and even some of the events unfolding in DC. To me, it's been at this point some well orchestrated drama, made for TV production to keep us all tuned in to what's happening in DC, the left right paradigm versus reality of what's happening across many states and many cities. And Paul, that is the declining quality of life that's happening, that in turn, in my opinion, is also escalating, causing a lot more violent crimes and an escalation of robberies and everything associated with economic decline, Paul.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, we have to sort of go back and really assess that the problems have manifest themselves increasingly since 2008. Obviously, 2020 changed the whole landscape quite significantly because of the pandemic. And if what you've said is borne out here. I made the point back last year, and I have said this point before, but it's worth reiterating that when I engaged with the government here and the sage advisors and said, look, it's one thing focusing on the scope of what you believe the pandemic to be. And we're not going to have a discussion today about what the pandemic is, what it is in reality, because that's irrelevant. We have to, I'm not so much focusing on that side, it's the fallout of what this is causing. And my point to them in the UK was, look, it's all well and good focusing on pandemic case numbers, hospitalizations and fatalities, and that's we well documented that we disagree with a lot of that analysis, but it's the fallout of what this is doing economically. I mean, only last week there was nearly 800,000 more people lost their jobs in the United States. That's we're talking 11 months after the sort of fallout of the pandemic started. So there's no let up in terms of that aspect. Then the question is, how much is that rigged? I mean, is it really a million? Or is it 1.2 million? We don't know. But there is all the economic side. So when people lose their jobs, then their immediate concerns are how can they pay for their rent, their mortgage? How are they going to be able to feed themselves and their family? So that's just the principal thing. Then you have all the physiological aspect where people are not getting treated who should be treated for medical conditions. Then you have the psychological aspect, and it's certainly becoming more and more prevalent in the media here. They're not exactly saying there's a mental health crisis, but they're kind of talking about the increase in mental health problems of people with alcoholism, people dying, domestic violence, domestic abuse, and this is going to unfortunately be symptomatic of what will go on within the sort of family unit, so to speak. You rightly then get to the point where the risk is as people become more and more destitute, then that spills out into a wider community. So the risk is you're going to have more violence, more robberies, more and potentially violent robberies, whereas people become more and more desperate. Therefore, then that spills out into the wider community. And these are the many factors that Western governments have not given any consideration to. And essentially, you can see that they quite legitimately, from their perspective, believe that this is just an economic blip. We've had, Bank of England coming out going, there's 250 billion pounds stashed away in people's banks. They're all ready to spend it all, and they'll spend the economy back into life. And of course, the reality of that's just not going to be the case, because increasing numbers of people are losing their jobs. When the furlough schemes end, assuming they do end, and they don't just keep them going for forever and a day, there's not going to be any jobs for them. So more and more people get made redundant, and then we get sucked into this cycle. And most certainly people who have not been in receipt of money because they're self-employed or whatever their particular circumstances are, have been spending savings anyway. So they do genuinely think this. It's like this idea that the vaccine will solve everything. Then everything will just spring back into life, and there's no consideration for the fact that once you implode an economy, you can't switch it back on magically. So there's this, for me, this powder keg that's brewing, where at the moment a lot of people here don't see this to be a problem. They don't recognize the fact they're furloughed, and therefore their job doesn't really exist. It only exists because the government's paying them 80% of their salary to sit at home effectively. And they're not aware of the consequences of what's unfolding. And the problem is that long after the virus is gone effectively, or gone to the extent that it's no longer deemed to be a problem, and all the governments around the world will all be slapping their backs going, oh, it was a great job done, then this underlying crisis which is unfolding now will just get worse and worse, and they'll wash their hands and try to claim that it had nothing to do with lockdown policy. It was nothing to do with anything that they were responsible for. It's just a bunch of circumstances dictated that this started to unfold. The thing they're not going to struggle to deny is the economic aspect. But already, we're seeing claims that suicide rates has got nothing to do with the lockdown. It's just denying that anything's got to do with the lockdown. And then there's this kind of really strange thing whereby in the past they've gone, well, if someone contracted COVID and died within 28 days, then it was recorded as a COVID death along with other line items. We're now having a situation where people are getting vaccinated. No, it's not. Let's not blow this out of proportion. It's not astronomical numbers. It's very small numbers, but there are people dying very soon afterwards, and they're going, it's nothing to do with the vaccine. So, this kind of manipulation of people's perspective. The other biggest problem for me, above all else, never mind the impossible situation regarding the economy, the financial system, and all societal problems that we've just discussed, it's that thing of fear. Because Ken rightly pointed out, being extremely knowledgeable about historical things, where he said in the aftermath of the Spanish flu outbreak, 1918-19, that it took people quite a few years to get back to normal because the fear was there. Well, the induced fear that they put into people is going to stifle the ability for society to return to normal. And that's going to have a huge burden as well. I mean, talking about protecting the NHS, which is just psychological ploy to make people do what they want them to do. It actually is going to place an intolerable burden on the health service going forward for matters they'll claim has no relation to these lockdown policy decisions. But the biggest problem is if we had ordinarily a functioning economy where, okay, it got a bit of a hit because of the pandemic, but the fundamentals underlying it were strong. We hadn't had all the government policy, monetary policy since 2008, and all the other problems that we know that exist in the Western world. Then arguably it could have been a transient thing. But when people have gone through all the trials and tribulations of coping and dealing with whether people have lost family members because of the virus, been affected directly or indirectly through the lockdown and all those things we've just discussed. The issue is they'll think that when this ends, that, that's the end of the problems. And on the blind side that's creeping up and is manifesting itself more and more is all these economic, financial problems that is going to hit them. So it's like they're already struggling, a lot of people, to cope with what's going on. They're going to have to face that as well. That is going to create an enormous crisis into mental health terms. To varying degrees, we can't quantify that. We're not even going to try to quantify it. Problem with that is how are people going to react to that? Now people will react in different ways, but the risk is it could manifest itself in very violent ways in some people. And then the issue is, as always, people want to blame someone, and they don't necessarily apportion blame where blame should be apportioned to. And that risks creating societal problems, which obviously is what you alluded to at the start, CJ.
Very well said, Paul. And it's, having two sons who are in their teens, it's very concerning. And, I have, friends who are practitioners as it relates to the mental health industry. And it's no doubt the reality of what's happening in terms of the amount of distress, the amount of anxiety that it's being created in particular on our youth. And unfortunately, it's just, one of those things. And they can do all the research they want. They can do all these studies, these data. I think at this point, Paul, it's just important to, to keep a close eye on our family members, to reach out for others and let them know they're not alone. I think at this point, everyone's had a little bit of mental stress, anxiety that's been associated with this. And we're cycling it close to a year. So that's a lot of fatigue, Paul, but it will take several years to, I don't necessarily think the word rehabilitate is correct, but to, especially with our youth who have been kept out of school, who've been socially isolated, plugged into their computers already a significant amount of time, more than what they're accustomed to talk about those things and why that mental health services will be just so important to help us navigate through this. And think of the kids who were born through this cycle, whose parents, for the right reasons, have probably kept their child really isolated for the most part, and just identifying, mom and dad. Think of that, how different it's going to be for them the first time that they're getting exposed to public places and people. So again, just the collateral things that are occurring, it's definitely a reason for pause to understand what's happening, to be conscientious of that with our friends, our family, our even the people tuning in today who may be struggling with their own situation. That it's okay. It's at this point it's kind of a normal process that we're all going through collectively. The important thing is, what do we do? What do we do to correct it, and coming up with solutions to help people, Paul?
Yeah, no, absolutely. People shouldn't be afraid to reach out. I mean, you make a point about the youth, and this is extremely important because they're not only having to go through the times we're going through now, but the problem is that the kind of economic, financial fallout, how long it takes to rebuild Western nations. How long is that going to take? I mean, it could take a decade. It doesn't mean nothing happens for a decade, but how is that going to be impacting them? how is it going to affect their, their future livelihood, their job prospects, and their ability to live the life they, rightly should want to live? And we're not talking about ludicrous extravagances. We're talking about all the things that people should be able to enjoy and have the opportunity to do. That may be curtailed to some extent, and that's going to be extremely hard for everybody. I mean, okay, there's people sort of retirement age who risk, retirement could be postponed indefinitely. They may not be able to retire the way they do. So I'm not just saying it all reflects on the younger generation, but they're beginning their life effectively as as adolescents or young adults, and they're going to have an enormous amount of strain put on them, which is going to be extremely difficult and challenging for them. There's no doubt. From my perspective, the youth of today are the future leaders of tomorrow. It's important that the younger people get the right start in life, they get the opportunities, and this could severely impact not just their generation, but it's a cyclical thing. If they have to go through very strenuous, arduous times as adolescents or young adults, or people in their 20s, whatever, how's that going to impact the generation that's coming after their children, etc.? So we have to be very careful. We don't just look at this in isolation and go, well, it only affects these people. This is not a sort of generational thing where it's just locked in and somehow we just magically produce the answers, all the solutions there, and it's not going to impact generations who haven't even been born yet, because it will do. To what degree, it's very difficult to ascertain at the moment. But yes, it's important. If people have neighbors who are on their own, just check in on them. It's like we have a neighbor. She's on her own. I mean, she's very, she's probably in her 60s or so. She's very, she's very mobile. She has a car, goes out, but she's largely on her own. So I've got her on WhatsApp, message her, is everything okay? If you've got any problems, just get in touch. And it's just simple things like that. You don't have to really do something for people at times. It's just that they know someone's there. I mean, it's not like she doesn't have family elsewhere, but it's just there's a neighbor who might be able to look out for someone, because we don't know what can happen. And we have to be very mindful of the fact that this, the pandemic is one thing, but it's the consequential actions of what that's leading to. And also what really doesn't help is all the ideas that the pandemic's engineered, and that's driven enormous fear into people, that there's some big nefarious plan with people moving chess pieces around for some other, which of course there's no basis of reality in that. But that has caused enormous fear in certain groups of people, which is just unnecessary fear. It's bad enough people having to deal with the tangible reality of what's unfolding, but to be sucked into a belief that this is also happening is extremely unhelpful. And and just one small point I want to make with regards to the whole thing to do with vaccines. Now, there was this whole story that keeps coming out about that they're going to inject chips into people. It's going to change people's DNA. They're going to kill tens and hundreds of millions of people with a vaccine. That has caused more damage than anything else with regards to people trying to make legitimate claims about the fact that there was vaccine, they've had vaccine policy, where what's the long-term testing that's been done, because it hasn't been done. And therefore people can raise legitimate questions, not saying I completely disagree with this, or I'm an anti-vax person, but I want to understand this better. That has been thrown into the long grass. You cannot get a sensible discussion out of anyone, because these people who started all these ludicrous rumors have now destroyed discourse in this matter, where there are legitimate questions. And this is another huge problem that has to stop, because it is so damaging to achieve any objective discourse about whether you're pandemic policy or to do with vaccination strategy, etc., etc. The things where there are legitimate points to raise. It's getting very, very difficult, because anyone who challenges anything is now branded as a conspiracy theorist, or you're just anti-vaccination, and that's your stance. Not whereas there should have been an opportunity for people to say, okay, in terms of your testing, you've done obviously various phases of testing, but what's the implications of this vaccine in 3 months, 6 months, a year on people? You at this point can't, quantify that with any degree of accuracy. Therefore, that's a legitimate concern, and people should be able to raise those points, and they can't. So, to all those people who've thrown all this nonsensical conspiracy theories out about vaccine, just think of the damage you've done to actually trying to get sensible discussions about this, which are legitimate. Because for me, these people don't realize the damage they're causing. And I don't doubt people legitimately believe things like this, but it's not reality. There are legitimate concerns with any such treatment, whatever treatment you have in hospitals. I mean, if you get operated on here, you have to sign a declaration that you accept the risk of what having surgery might do to you, even though the risk might be minuscule. You sign declarations, and that's fair enough. Okay, that's acceptable. But there's a world of difference between dealing with things pragmatically in terms of the real risks. And we need to be able to get to the point where when we can have discussions about things, it doesn't all get, sort of reduced to this level of conspiracy. Because the other thing is, when you try to raise legitimate concerns about economic matters and all this, that can often be swept aside as that's just scaremongering, and that's part of this whole conspiracy theory angle. So that's an important consideration that we need to realize. If we want to engage with government, if we want to engage with people, then we have to do it in an appropriate manner. And I just wanted to make a point on that, which I think really eloquently deals with how people can affect some real positive change on a level you would ordinarily go, I don't believe this is possible. Now, what happened in the Netherlands, they've obviously had this curfew overnight that they put in to do with the pandemic. And there was a group of people in the Netherlands who took this case to The Hague because they said this shouldn't be allowed. They have no jurisdiction to do this. Now, The Hague listened to this, and they agreed that the Dutch government, should lift it with immediate effect. And the argument was that when the Dutch government introduced such curfew measures, it was not under the auspices of emergency powers available for them to introduce such a measure on that basis. There's a positive thing where when people do things in the appropriate manner, you can affect positive change. Now, okay, the government might appeal it, but the point is it was raised in a legitimate way. The group went through the appropriate process, and they've affected some change that proves, as far as The Hague was concerned, that the government had no right and should lift it with immediate effect. So that's what can be done. But the other thing is just, I understand people focusing on certain things because it's something they particularly sort of align with or believe in. But it has to be something that's actually worth challenging as well. I don't doubt there's myriads of statistical data out there that disproves why lockdowns don't work and why the policy decisions were wrong. But at the end of the day, how can you actually affect change in that regard? It's difficult. But if you focus on the humanitarian angle with regards to this, then you're in a position where that resonates with people. When you start to focus on this is affecting people's livelihoods, their mental health, they're not getting operated on for surgical procedures because of the issue of filling up the in our case the National Health Service. When you focus on those legitimate things get done. I mean, and it's like, okay, there's the footballer in this country, Marcus Rashford, who focused on free school meals that should be given to pupils when they're even not in school. He then made a great campaign, and he succeeded. And he brought the government to heel on 2 or 3 occasions because he's focusing on something people identify with. But when you focus on statistical data, there's numerous people who can contradict it, and you just get stuck in this mire. Now, that's people's individual choice, and I'm not criticizing them for doing it. I'm just saying I don't think it's a productive way to get that engagement where you can try and affect some positive change in people, because you need the masses of the people to identify with you. that what you're doing or saying has some legitimacy, because that's the only way you change opinion in government. I mean, we're not okay. Marcus Rashford's a famous footballer, so he has more clout in society, but people like us don't. We're just ordinary people that the vast majority of the population don't know, so it's harder for us to achieve those objectives. But there is a huge crisis in the making, not just economically and financially, but societally, in all nations in the world to varying degrees, but Western nations in particular. And these are not going to go away. They're going to be here for now, in a year, in 5 years, and maybe 10 years to varying degrees. And we need to be sure that at that time that people are aware of this in advance, and also that representation is made, by people at government level or state level or whatever it might be, to say, look, this is a crisis that's in the making. And to raise that point, because at the moment, I think a lot of people just don't see this coming. They don't see it's a problem. By the time it is a problem, and then it's too late to deal with anything, because then when it's a crisis, all Western society governments are incapable of dealing with crises. And it's not because they're intentionally doing anything. They're just absolutely useless. And useless in ways that should worry people a lot more than whatever they believe nefarious is going on.
Paul, yeah, very well stated. And, just to touch base real quick on, on that, a lot of the disinformation that gets spread, all that kind of stuff that's associated with it, you have to keep in mind that a lot of that information that comes out very well could be by design to really disrupt, to if you will, cancel out the ability to have the debates, have the discussions in regards to what's really happening, and enables for the most part the tech giants to say, hey, you know what, we're going to shut this down because it's just so far from accurate. And I just really implore everyone at this point, the stage that we're in of this game as we enter this decade, is to be very strategic in your thoughts, to really analyze things properly, on your own. In the age of information that we're currently in, everything is about clickbaits, everything is about headlines, everything is about so many words and less, versus actually trying to do your own research. Now, I know it's impossible to do that on everything, right? It's nearly impossible. But at the same time, do some research, do some understanding, ask yourself the right questions. It's just going to be so important because, again, for so many of us, we've been so plugged into the last few years, and I'm guilty of it, Paul, guilty of the distractions of the political arena that's occurred around the globe, whether it's Brexit, whether it's here in the United States, what's happening, and just coming more to an understanding. In my opinion, is that was that on purpose? Was that by design to keep humanity from truly understanding the dynamics of what's occurring, right in front of us? And so I just implore everyone that it's going to be a matter that don't wait for government to come to the rescue. Don't wait for somebody else to find a path forward for you as we're navigating through this great reset. It's going to be you as the individual to take action, not only for yourself, your family, but your community. Try to avoid the static as much as possible. And I firmly believe the noise is there by design of the understanding. And this winter storm that hit for the most part across the Midwest, the Southwest, just exposes a lot of that, of what that unpreparedness could look like in the event that there's not plans within the community for rolling power outages, for food supply collapses, for groceries being inoperable because of that. And again, I think that the power of the community is just so important right now, Paul. And why I say that don't put too much faith or confidence in government is because a lot of the policies that we're going to see witness out and rolled out the next few years are really probably going to even escalate or contribute to the demise of everything and the escalation of inflation. I don't really have any faith at all in any of our political leaders at this point that are going to navigate us through that. And that's why that power of the individual becomes so important, Paul.
Yeah, absolutely. And you make an extremely valid point. I mean, and here's just the one example that highlights why it goes back to when Trump was elected, and I wrote to the Trump administration explaining why it was absolutely critical, given that that he knew full well the dollar was going to collapse, that the US was no longer going to be a hegemon, that the US would have to become an equal partner at the table, and that there was going to be enormous economic decline, financial system collapse, etc., etc. And my point was, it is absolutely critical that you're able to legitimately find ways to finance a huge infrastructure rebuild. Now, infrastructure rebuild is important for a number of considerations. And one of the obvious ones is you have to ensure that you have an adequate power grid to handle all eventualities. That could be extreme heat. It can be extreme cold. I mean, we've seen, and I'm not just picking solely on Texas, but just to look at what has unfolded with regards to Texas and the fact that basically the power grid is essentially failed for millions of people. There's an example of why it is critical to have infrastructure in place. Power lines is a statement to the obvious, but it goes much further than that. If you want to become a more self-sufficient with a nation with strong manufacturing base, you have to have roads, you have to have railways, bridges, you have to have access to ports, and it has to be done in a timely manner. So if your rail links aren't up to scratch, you're not going to be able to put the throughput to get stuff to port to export to other nations, as just one small example. So the infrastructure builds out on a kind of interstate. You've got within states, and this is critical. And what this is highlighted is, with regards to Texas, is just how vulnerable people can be to okay, granted, what you perceive to be an extreme of weather, but does that mean extremes of weather can't happen in the future and won't happen more often? And we're not talking about climate change before anything suggests I am. I'm just talking that this is just what can happen. And vulnerabilities can start to escalate. And if you don't have power, then people can't access, the ability to buy food, to buy, essential items. So that impacts people. People don't have heating. That makes vulnerable people more likely to die of hypothermia, for example, or to suffer, serious health problems as a result of this. So we're just looking in one small example why it's critical that you have the necessary infrastructure. And the United States' infrastructure is appalling. I mean, there's no other word. I'm not saying the UK is great either, but the United States infrastructure has been neglected for decades, and it's going to increasingly cost, significantly more than it did in 2017 to start to resolve the problem. It's going to cost trillions of dollars, and somehow that's going to have to be paid for. And you can't just print dollars and pay for it, because that's just not reality. I mean, if you want to hasten Weimar, the United States, then be my guest doing that. But the point is, that's critical, and it has to be addressed. And we don't want to see situations where Texas happens in other states for other reasons. And, it's funny, only about a week ago, I made comments also on the Gavfly, but also on Twitter and on my own podcast, that energy and food security is going to be a critical factor in the next decade or so. Well, here's another example where we see food security is a problem in Texas, and energy security was also a problem. So it's critical these matters are dealt with, and because people will have lost their lives in very tragic circumstances, and this can easily be avoidable if you put a robust power grid into the United States. Yeah, it costs money, but forgive me for being so radical, but I think it'd be far better investing whatever it costs to build a robust power grid in the United States, rather than going along and bombing some nation into oblivion. And there's an obvious choice there. Do you want to kill people abroad, or do you want to better the quality of life inside America? The other thing it does, it highlights very clearly that all these airy-fairy ideas that we can just easily radically move away from hydrocarbons and create alternative power grid using solar energy, etc. It can supplement it, but it can't replace it. I mean, there's issues where you get very low temperatures and wind turbines, even if the wind's blowing at 50 miles an hour, the wind turbines cease to turn because they freeze up. Mechanically, they're not capable of handling those sort of temperatures. Well, if we start to, and there's some people who believe we might be heading into kind of a mini ice age, we have to be careful what that means. It just means global temperatures could drop 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 degrees. Well, it means much cooler summers, but correspondingly much harsher winters. Well, if Texas started to be a problem across the United States, then what does that mean for the entire population going forward? I mean, okay, some obvious states will not be affected, but it's going to affect substantially more people across much of America, as just one example. And that's not unique. So these are problems that need addressing. And these are the critical decisions that have to be made that, yes, we do have to be more responsible custodians. We do have to find alternative forms of energy. I don't dispute that. It'd be far better to have nuclear fusion, for example, which could provide virtually limitless energy at very virtually non-existent prices. That is a good substitute, but that's not commercially possible at the moment. There's a lot of work going on globally and with international cooperation to make that happen. Now, a lot of people are very adverse to nuclear reactors, but modern reactors are far more efficient and stable than old ones. People tend to think of 3 Mile Island and things like that, or Chernobyl or whatever. Well, the world's changed radically in terms of that technology. But this needs to be a move away from the idea that that some of the solutions in place now are not going to work going forward unless they significantly improve the technology of wind turbines. And well, I'm not advocating wind turbines as a solution. I'm just saying if they want to do that, they're going to have far more robust solution in place to prevent wind turbines being dramatically affected by very low temperatures. The argument might be, what happens to wind turbines if you get extremely high temperatures? I don't have the answer to that, but there are considerations that need to be made going forward. But this is why we keep saying the United States needs to stop going abroad, blowing the world up at the cost of hundreds of billions of dollars a year. And I think in the last 20 years, it's something like $25 trillion they've just blown up effectively. That money should have been redirected and spent on the United States and made it a first-class, first-world nation in terms of its infrastructure. And it wasn't. And that's the thing that bothers me more, is people don't ever seem to complain about this. And we've said this before, but it needs to be said again. People should be making representation saying, I don't want us going all over the world trying to seek to gain militarily or financially in some capacity, or just to project our hegemon across the world, although of course that's now increasingly failing. Let's start to look at ways that we can reinvest to rebuild America before Texas becomes a crisis across the entire nation, and not just in terms of power grids and energy considerations. But it's like part of the reason American companies don't want to come back, apart from China and Southeast Asia being far better marketplaces for them to be in to export, but also to sell within that enormous market space. It's also, well, where are they going to put these businesses? I mean, if you want to distribute employment opportunities across America, and you say, well, I know, let's go and build some plants in I don't know, North Dakota or South Dakota. Where's the infrastructure to support doing that? So that's actually feasible to do that, and you have road, rail links, and bridges, etc., that can support moving such technology back to the US and distributing it so you can get employment opportunities across America rather than concentrating it in Silicon Valley as an example of where that policy decision is made, where it's always concentrated in certain areas. These are strategic decisions that need to be made. And frankly, rather like the United Kingdom, I don't see anyone who's even got the capability to begin to understand the problems and even have any remote understanding of what those challenges will lead to and how they can be resolved.
Yeah, Paul, I'm all supportive of sustainability, cleaning our environment. And again, I think it really falls back to the individual and how they manage. If they haven't started a recycle bin, that's a basic step, right? A recycle bin within your house to ensure that plastics, whatever can be recycled, is done so. But we've, this idea of moving to a complete electrifying of everything that, ridding of all the carbon yes, it's a very aggressive mindset, but I like what you said in regards to being a supplemental in terms of, solar, wind, and batteries as far as a supplemental to that. And again, Texas is a perfect example of what's happened. The trillions of dollars that we have spent around the globe on wars that have occurred. Think of the environmental destruction that's occurred because of those bombs, the buildings, the devastation that's occurred, and those trillions of dollars could have been spent here domestically in the United States on our energy systems, on finding ways for cleaner, more efficient fuels. I always get upset, Paul, when I'll see a perfectly good building here, in particular where I live, where maybe that building just didn't quite fit the specs of what was going to what they envisioned there. Perfect example, there was a restaurant in one of the areas. It was it was a beautiful building, it was a beautiful restaurant. It couldn't have been less than probably 15 years old, and the developer went in with a different restaurant chain and said, you know what, we're not going to retrofit to make this work. We've got this image, this blueprint of what we look, and they tear it all completely down. Maybe that's a good place to start. But again, you take a look at some of the policies that have been instituted by the government with several different administrations. This typically leads to mismanagement of money. We see that a lot of the time the government policies that get instituted with these green energy policies, it basically lines the pockets of their donors. The billions of dollars that get spent to fund these corporations that in turn will launder that money to excessive payments, to all these things, and make very little impact. And that's part of the thought process. So again, getting back to the inevitable, we are seeing some concerning signs, one of which being gas prices for the first time breaching that $60 threshold. Many, in my opinion, laughingly are saying that, well, it's because of the confidence of getting back to the economy scale, and I don't think that's what it is. I think it's concern for disruptions to coal, to other energies, in the meantime thinking through this. But you make a lot of great points as it relates to how we can get that accomplished, how to move forward, and getting to the idea of most people understanding the inevitable. What's happening is that we are witnessing a decline in here in the United States, and finding a path forward to get us back at again, this idea of reindustrializing the U.S. It's great ideas. It's going to take quite a bit of time. But if we put all our faith and confidence in our elected officials, elected quote unquote leaders, that's simply not going to happen. We're going to see that continuation of corruption, of billions of dollars being spent, going to the hedge funds, going to that top 1% class that for the last 20, 30 years has really led to the decline and the absolute demise of the working poor and the middle class in America, Paul. So we have a lot of work to do, and I'm confident that we can get there, but it's not going to happen with people who are still plugged in to your mainstream media on TV, people that are still getting their information and news from the television, from these legacy media corporations, who continue basically not to really share any information of what's really coming this way, and what's led to people not completely understanding what's happening, Paul.
Well, absolutely. And just on the point of, I mean, here's a great example where there's a complete lack of joined up thinking is electric cars. People go, Well, a great way, we don't have the old gas guzzling cars. I know it's not like it was in the 70s with the 8 liter engines and all that nonsense, but we're going to cut down on diesel and petrol consumption. But here's the point: if everybody had an electric car, how much more electricity production would you have to create? The power grid couldn't handle it. The other thing is, which means it needs enormous infrastructure expenditure, which it does anyway. But the problem with that is, how do you produce what? How do you generate electricity? Is that an efficient way of generating electricity, depending on how it's created in power stations? And then the other point is, you've got all these batteries. When these batteries have reached the end of their serviceable lifespan, where are they going to go? You're just going to dump them in some landfill? Well, that's not environmentally, a good decision either. So there needs to be a lot more thought process. There's no doubt we need to be better custodians. I mean, and a great example was what someone said to me is, because of the pandemic, there's all these people disposing of face masks, and that's an environmental nightmare. They're ending up in landfills, they're ending up in oceans, they're ending up everywhere. They're causing a huge environmental problem. There's an example where they think they're resolving one problem, and that's entirely questionable, and they've created a huge environmental problem, which is a legitimate problem. So there is no thought process again or joined up thinking in this, but we do need to be better custodians. I mean, the oceans are full of plastics. This is insane. This should not be the case. And so therefore there's legitimate reasons. But again, the problem is people fall into two camps. They think the whole thing is complete nonsense on the one side, and then there's people on the other side who just buy it all. Well, there are some good aspects to it and there are some bad aspects, and we need to meet in the middle and start to have proper policy decisions, and don't allow this to be turned into an opportunity for people to stand there claiming it's all green technology or green energy or whatever, and it turns out it's absolute nonsense, and in fact it's completely the opposite, and as you rightly say, it ends up lining the pockets of the usual suspects who make a killing out of it, although increasingly, of course, that becomes rather irrelevant given what's coming financially and economically. But the point is, it shouldn't be allowed to be subverted in that way. So these are part of huge challenges and major changes that will come globally. And at the end of the day, when someone, if China's come out and goes, we want to be carbon neutral by 2050, as an example, people shouldn't just immediately go, oh, bunch of nonsense. This is rubbish, and the whole thing's, it's an idiotic statement. Okay, what do they intend doing? Is any of this really beneficial? Is the things that, and I'm not just saying people should follow what China's, does America have some good ideas? Does the world have some good ideas and ways that we can actually do something that's beneficial? Then there needs to be this collective approach, which is a lot more to do with cooperation amongst nations instead of this zero-sum game mentality that sadly the United States still decides is the only option. It's always my way or the highway. We do it this way, and if you don't, then you're against us, and therefore we have to neutralize you in some capacity, quite literally sometimes in war or regime change, whatever. That is a big, huge mindset problem, and that exists not just in the United States. The UK suffers from the zero-sum game mentality as well, and is refusing to let go of that stance. But these are important. We are at a huge inflection point in history, probably the biggest inflection point in the last 1,000 years, maybe even more, maybe 2,000 years, and maybe, I don't know, but it is a huge change that is coming about, and people need to start to first understand that this is a reality, but also not to get sucked again into the fear game that they're going to turn the world into this dystopian hell for humanity. Because just look at what most of the world is rotating to, is changing and adopting a completely different way of thinking, a way of doing things. So it's not happening across the world in the way that people are led to believe. It's actually changing positively, but change takes a long time, because the mindset of people is very difficult to change, and people are very ingrained in their belief systems. They just want to hang on to something, and unfortunately, as we're going through this change, people are finding other things they want to hang on to because they think that's going to save the world and save humanity. And in fact, it's completely flawed. Without laboring the Q movement, there's a classic one where people just jumped in, wanting to desperately believe in something. There was never a reality. And this was, unfortunately, people wasted a lot of time and energy. And when we go through this big transition, there are going to be people out there who will seek to profit for their own gain and will say and do all manner of things because it suits their own agenda when it has no basis in reality. And we have to be extremely careful that we don't get sucked into that mindset. And here's a really good example of this. The idea that the world's controlled, as people believe, by all these groups of families, and they dictate all policy decisions, and they sit there moving chess pieces, and everything is done. So when the collapse happens, it's because they want the collapse to happen. Where in reality, it's all nonsense. Now, at the end of the day, who benefits the most in us collectively having the mindset that that's how the world operates? Not us, the status quo as it really exists. Because if you drive enough people into believing that it's hopeless because there's this hierarchy controlling things, they get despondent, they give up, and they believe it's reality. They're the biggest ones who gain from this, not us as people who will actually sit there and go, well, no, that's not how the world operates. That's not how it actually functions. This is how it functions, and all the things we've discussed previously. That therefore would empower people to go, well, actually, we can affect some positive change and we can make things happen if we collectively come together for the common good of the people nationally or internationally. And that's why I get very fed up with the fact of people passing off all this dystopian view of the future, this idea of this controlling force that's going to turn the world into a totalitarian dictatorship. Well, that's just fear mongering on a different level, and it drives people into being extremely negative, feeling very consumed by what's going on, instead of feeling this is an inflection point in history where major change is happening, and we're seeing it in nations that people in Western nations don't pay any attention to. It's very difficult, but if people get the opportunity, go to Southeast Asia, go and look at what's going on there and see the big differences from 10, 20, 30 years ago. Now that's the ascendant power in the world is Southeast Asia, and it's building out from there. That's the future. The future isn't this insane West that's collapsing, and as the West collapses, it becomes more and more insane, more dysfunctional. People are seeing things going, I can't believe this is happening. But this is what happens in a dysfunctional empire that's folding. It just becomes more and more completely irrational. There's no thought applied to anything that it does. It's just knee-jerk reaction. And it just more and more just digs a hole for itself and consumes itself. And the other thing is, don't get sucked into that. This is just a part of the process which happens in history when empires do fold. They just become insane. They become utterly chaotic. There's nothing rational about their behavior. There's no thought applied to anything. It's largely based in the fact that they don't think the empire is collapsing, so therefore they just carry on doing all the things they've done, which is why the West is carrying on with its insane zero-sum game mentality. And the rest of the world's looking at them going, why are you doing this? We don't want to, if you want to do it, just get out of our way, because that's not the world we're living in and we're moving more and more towards. And that is a huge, important distinction. So when I say that the world isn't controlled the way people think it is, it's because it's self-evident it is. It's that obvious. And if people continue to believe it's it's a deliberate implosion, why didn't they do it in 2008? Why did they spend 12 years trying to keep the empire going and still trying to keep the empire going with insane policies? For one reason, because they know once the empire's gone, what fills the void is the Eurasian multipolar axis, which is growing out across the world. And once that's manifests itself and becomes the ascendant power, it's over for them. That's why they're not going to deliberately implode anything, because they're signing their own death sentence by doing it, which is why they didn't do it in 2008, when if the logical conclusion is that's what they were going to do, that's when they should have done it, because the Belt and Road didn't exist. China wasn't anywhere near as economically strong. Russia, neither. Russia was going through some extremely difficult period in its history while it was still going through a recovery process. Southeast Asia wasn't anything like it is now. So that was the opportunity to do it. And they didn't. And because they didn't do it, because it was never an intention. That's just made up fiction in the alt media to feed fear. Why? Because fear grips people. Euphoria grips people and fear. So they have a captive audience who keeps coming back because they want to hear all the fear that's going on in the world, or they want to hear all the euphoria that's going on, which is why even now Trump's no longer president. People still believe that somehow magically something's happening and Trump's going to appear, whether it's next week, next month, or some other point to be president because Biden isn't the legitimate president, etc., etc. And that's euphoria where people, and they just keep buying into this. But the question is, there's no reality to it. And the same with the fear. There are things to be concerned about, as we've just discussed, legitimate concern. But when do I see these same people spreading the fear, talking about the legitimate concerns that affect every one of us, but more so in Western nations? Where's the discussion about that? Why aren't they highlighting, energy concerns and highlighting food security and highlighting the need to have, robust infrastructure going forward to rebuild America? And why are they never discussing the tangible objective things that will grab more and more people who are now getting very disaffected by the political system in this country? People are now kind of washing their hands of mainstream politics, which is progress, but also it opens them up to the risk of being consumed by someone who fills the vacuum, which can be equally problematic. But anyway, that's a separate point. That's what it should be focused on. Why is it all this dystopian scaremongering that all these horrendous things are going to be done to humanity? And bear in mind, they've been talking about it for years, and it's never happened, and it won't happen in the future. But we are in extremely challenging times, and these are the things people should be discussing. And frankly, how many people are actually discussing this in reality? Okay, we do, and we're not unique, but we're a very small microcosm in an alternative media, for want of a better description, that never focuses on the things that actually need to be discussed. Why? Because a lot of people go, oh, that's boring, it's not entertaining, it's not sensationalism, it's not, it doesn't grip me because it's either driving me into euphoria or I'm gripped because of the fear of what's happening. I'm sorry, but this has been wholly as unproductive. And for me, as much as the mainstream media is an appalling mechanism, the alt media needs to take a long, strong, hard look at itself and start to reevaluate what its role should be going forward, and stop trying to be sources of entertainment and clickbait, and start actually trying to galvanize and form a big community that says, we have these problems and we want to build a movement that tries to affect some positive change even when all the chaos is unfolding.
Yeah, great points, Paul. And I think overall, I get contacted, or there is a significant amount of more people who are asking questions, Paul. People who are getting a sense that, hey, something is wrong, something is happening, and they can't quite put their finger on it, trying to understand it. And it could be the first time that they're being exposed to this information that, hey, there's a shift that's occurring. They don't understand it. They've never had to understand it, for whatever reason. And that's okay. I have friends, good friends, who reach out to me sometimes that, hey, I've tried talking to other friends. I've tried talking to family members, and, they just do not get it. They do not get what is truly happening. And And I think for that sense of sanity, that's okay. I think essentially those people will come around to understand this paradigm shift that's occurring. But at the same token of that, there are people who are open to some of these ideas in terms of, the a network within the community that you live. Uh, you know, I see it every day in terms of people helping each other, through these situations. By far, Paul, I would state that I think as far as society, that we are much closer to each other and have that same belief in helping one another than a lot of times that we're led to believe. So my point is to take that idea, to begin some of those conversations, to assess things where you are in your community, to begin, fortifying yourself, whether it's a clean, food supply, whether it's, shelter, or, you may be called away and need somebody to take care of a family member for, whatever particular reasons, to start building, those networks within the community that you live in. If you haven't taken time to knock on your neighbor's door, to know who your neighbor is, to introduce yourselves, now's the time to begin that process. And I'm determined. I know it'll take some time, but more people will start tuning into solutions based content, solutions based idea, because they will, start to see things unfold a little bit and be more curious as to, okay, well, why am I just learning this? Why did I not know that the purchasing power of my dollar is not sustainable? Why are these things happening? Why are companies continuing to close? Why is it that we were told that things would return back to normal as much as possible, but they're not happening? Why are they talking about that this could be the decade of all these things occurring? And eventually, when they run out of attempting to, really to create, control the narrative, is when those people will start to open up to ideas, some of the information that we're sharing, to say, hey, there's a whole other set of dynamics that's occurring outside of just the paradigm of the things that you focus, that you listen into. And we're not mad at you. That's okay. But come around to our conversation and engage in it, and help us to spread the word, because we don't have all the solutions, Paul. No one truly does,
No.
and I know that the people that are listening right now, they may have some great ideas that to share with one another to kind of help, navigate through this. So I'm very optimistic. I'm confident that, as a humanity, we can move forward. We're just going to have to not necessarily win, but we're going to have to engage and to get people to open up to the different ideas of listening, just one person at a time. That's all it takes. Don't worry about reaching the thousands, the 100,000. Worry about one person at a time. And if we do that, I'm confident that we can make strides to helping each other out, Paul.
Yeah, absolutely. And just a couple of final points. It's an old cliche, but from acorns, oak trees are grown. And you alluding to your point about one person at a time. And the other thing is, we need to all be mindful that what's someone else's problem today, given what's unfolding, could become our problem tomorrow. And it's very, very well, because no one can predict what is going to unfold. I don't want to be, we talk about driving people into fear, but there is a lot of unknowns. We can't quantify precisely what's going to unfold as a consequence of the economic, which it is going to be economic carnage, and the whole sort of financial system is imploding. Of that, there is no doubt. Now, there's ways that can be remedied sooner rather than later, but we're not here to discuss that today. But the important thing is there are going to be plenty of people out there who don't even realize there's a future problem, and it's going to creep up on them unbeknownst to them, and then they're going to have to deal with this or try to deal with it. But there are people out there who may understand things to a larger or less degree, who think they're immune from things, but they may not be. So, we can't have this idea we're all islands and we can somehow function independently, and someone else's problems not my problem because my problems aren't theirs, because people may be consumed by problems where they need people around in the future, and that applies to all of us to varying degrees. So we need to be mindful of that, and realize that by having a collective approach. And it's not with, as you say, in terms of communities and neighborhoods, that people will be able to help each other through the times that are coming, because as tough as the pandemic's been for people, for all the reasons we've highlighted, what's going forward is going to be extremely challenging as well, and will affect people for all the same reasons, but for obviously completely different circumstances. So we have to, or not entirely different, because there is an overlap between the two, clearly, as we said. But we need to always be mindful of that and realize that, that it could be our problem tomorrow, next week, next month, next year. And we then may need to rely on others as well. So, and therefore, that's the reason to build a community feel to how we need to address the problems. And at the end of the day, it's for me. It's since a child, I have never understood why people find it so hard just to get on with each other. I mean, it's the 21st century now. Well, see, I was young in the 20th century. It was, for me, it was astonishing as a young child, and people were far better at interacting then. But I look at it now and go, this is the 21st century. And yet, in many ways, we've regressed as humanity in terms of our interaction with each other. And I made just one final point, a tweet where I said, often some of the greatest friends I've got are the people who we disagree about things, but they're not like life affirming things, but we disagree. But you know what? But we're genuine with each other. They're true friends. That's what counts. So disagreeing with people's fine, when it doesn't matter. Yeah, I have my opinion and views on Bitcoin. I'm never going to change them. But so what? Don't get upset that I have that view, that I disagree with you. It doesn't ultimately matter. I'm offering my perspective because that's how I think it will play out. I have confidence in that, but am I going to be 100% correct? Well, no, but that doesn't matter. We need to get to the point where we can agree to disagree on things, but realize that the fundamental traits of what are all the relationships in our lives depend on the fact that people are genuine with each other, they can trust each other, that they'll support each other no matter what, through the good times and the bad times. That doesn't just apply to people in direct relationships. I feel that applies to friendship as well, and it's extremely important that just because you disagree with someone about something, who cares? Is it fundamentally important? No. I mean, then it's not an issue. I mean, we're never all going to agree on everything, but does it matter? No, it really doesn't. But the fundamental traits is that when you have relationships and friendships, those people are always going to be there for you. When they've got something wonderful to celebrate in life, or when they need, a shoulder to cry on, for want of a better description, to deal with the trials and tribulations of how they're going to have to cope with adversity that affects them in life. And that's where humanity has gone completely wrong. We've become very insular. We have this cancel culture mentality, and it applies in all walks of life. There's people who condemn it but do it themselves as well. At the end of the day, there's people I could profusely disagree with on political matters. I don't share anything politically minded with them, but who cares? I like them as people because they're genuine, because they're warm people. You have a real friendship with them. Their political viewpoint is not a deal breaker, and it should never be. The deal breaker should be that you can't trust people, they're not genuine people, and therefore that's not the basis for friendships or relationships in general.
Yeah, very well said, Paul. Want to thank everyone for tuning in. Again, if you have not done so yet, please jump over, check out Paul's work over at theseriousreport.com. And also, again, check out the gadfly.vhx.tv. Learn about our subscription-based content that's available. You can start a 30-day free trial and then decide whether you do the $10 a month or the $100 a year. I want to thank everyone for tuning in. And Paul, great conversation today, and I'm confident we'll do this again real soon.
Yes, and a pleasure. And at the end of the day, let's just try and grow a different perspective amongst everybody and how we interact with each other and what matters. And we go back to what defines us as people. because that's the way collectively we can get through this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Everyone have a great day and take care. Thank you.